Thank you so much for coming. I just want to begin the talk by emphasizing in particular that the Jubilee Center has been thinking about capitalism for quite a long time. We've addressed in detail concerns such as stakeholder relations, the prevalence of debt in the financial sector, and the impacts of banks taking on more risk-related activity with reference to limited liability. And all this work has been done by really successful economists who have worked at places like the World Bank and the IMF. I myself, however, am not an economist. My training is in history and in theology. And my work here in particular in the past 2 years has looked at things, cultural issues like individualism, artificial intelligence, and sport. And some of those publications are available here today. So for the last few months, I've been grappling with remuneration broadly conceived. So not specifically executive remuneration. And I've been doing that by primarily drawing upon ancient Jewish and Christian literature. This has several fascinating implications, I think, for broader society, and especially as we look forward to the possibilities of universal basic income. I'm not sure if you've heard discussions about this with automation and things like that. But today we're going to focus, as advertised, on the extreme ratios that we read about every day in the news. Now, these ratios, right, they hardly need mentioning. The average FTSE 100 CEO pay to average UK worker is currently right about 160 to 1. In the US, that number is well above 300. You might find different numbers depending on how you measure, because some people go by averages, some measure by median, and then it will change if you're looking at the ratio within a company versus the ratio of a CEO to broader society. But regardless, the public outcry is quite clear, and I think that we can agree that that's why most of us are here today. So in this talk, I want to first summarize some of the main elements of remuneration to help us understand how we've got to where we are today. This will be some basic things, and I'm doing this for, especially as a non-specialist, just to make sure we're all on the same page, really. Then I will share what I believe are the key points from the ancient literature regarding compensation. And finally, I'll share some implications these might have for today. And then we're going to open things up for a time of questions and discussion at the end. Make sure there's plenty of time for that. So the simplest definition you will find for remuneration is something like compensation for services rendered. Within a compensation or remuneration package, there are several components. These include things like base wages and salary, incentives, which are often linked to performance, things like bonuses and commissions. Then there are fringe benefits, things we're familiar with, pensions, insurance, holiday. There are perquisites, or perks as they're commonly known, things like vehicles and lodging. And then significantly for this talk, there are the non-monetary components, which we're going to come back to later, but these include things such as intellectual stimulus, comfort, self-satisfaction, personal growth, reputation, etc. Now, the balance of these components in a remuneration package is supposed to be determined by the board of directors based upon the advice of an independent remuneration committee and sometimes additional consultants who are hired. And all of this is then meant to be approved by the vote of shareholders. Whether or not this process is as streamlined and transparent as it often purports to be is up for debate, but that's how it's supposed to work, just so you have some understanding of the structure. That brings us to why exactly do so many CEOs get paid so much? I'm going to cover just a few of the most basic reasons. Some people prefer to approach this topic via different theories of remuneration. So there's reward and expectancy theory. This deals with the fact that employees are motivated by previous outcomes and kind of results that they can expect. There's equity theory, which deals with being kind of fairly paid. There's agency theory, which seeks to align the desires of the employer and the employee. But one of the most blatant causes for exorbitant executive pay today is the prevalence of shares and share options. in remuneration packages, and oftentimes these actually make up the majority of the packages. We have instances, you may be aware of, people like Jeff Bezos of Amazon, Steve Jobs, Elon Musk, who work either for $1 a year or sometimes nothing. How do they do that and still become so wealthy? Well, it's all the shares that are involved in their package. Quick explanation: a share is just kind of giving the shares. A share option is the ability to purchase a share at a given price for a certain amount of time, basically. Now, to give a little insight into how we've got to this situation regarding shares, it really came into prevalence in the early 80s, as far as I can tell. And it was originally supposed to work against excessive pay, actually, by getting, the phrase is, more skin in the game, kind of like entrepreneurs had. Unfortunately, this kind of backfired in a way because it ended up being a replacement, rather than a replacement, a supplement to salary. And because tax regulation and governance regulation, especially in the US, kind of lagged behind the corporate practice, companies realized that they could compensate really, really large amounts to their CEOs and also dodge a lot of kind of taxes and different things like that. And it just continued to grow. More basic reasons involving the large payouts for CEOs involve things like skill. These are very, very skilled people. Motivation, highly motivated despite various disconnects between pay and performance after certain levels, it seems. Then there's experience and risk, which we'll talk about later. And a phrase you often hear, I mentioned it already, is this alignment of goals with the shareholders. Now, it's important to recognize, I want to point out that even though there's this kind of public outcry or dissatisfaction, shareholders of most companies still overwhelmingly vote in favor of these remuneration packages that we find. It seems that perhaps one of the reasons is the way that the language is phrased. Shareholders might not be equipped or able to actually dissect or understand all of the things that are involved in these remuneration policies. Now, I've saved you a lot of work. I've read through literally dozens of these remuneration policies from various companies, and I can tell you it's quite, it can be convoluted at times, even if there are clear graphics. One of my favorite phrases was adjusted operating cash flow, and I couldn't figure out anywhere what that meant. There was no clear definition about what that was. The final reason given for high pay, and this is an important one for our talk today, is the competition of the market determining the fair pay, right? This is involved in both attracting a CEO, because you want to pay them an attractive salary, but also retaining them over the long term. However, the CEO market doesn't actually work. Some people argue that this is actually an example of market failure because the price is not going up naturally, it's going up artificially. This happens as Remco's remuneration committees establish a benchmark, they call it, based upon peer companies. So they look at a group of companies and say, okay, this company over here is paying their CEO $5 million, this one's paying them $10 million, this one $7 million. And they recommend to the board, they say, well, we advise you should pay your CEO somewhere between, let's say, 5 and 10 million, okay? That means that the board recognizes 7 million right smack dab in the middle, or something around that area. That would just communicate to our CEO that they're average. So we actually want to bump that up slightly. We want to pay them above average because we want to attract them. And then the next time these different committees work and look at peer groups, that average has been bumped up. This is called the ratchet, or some people call this the ratchet effect. This is really, really important because actually it's just bumping itself up and there's no way to rein it in. It's fascinating because the FRC has said in the past several kind of corporate governance codes they've put out that this should not happen. They said you should guard against ratchet effects. You shouldn't let this happen. But they don't give very clear advice about how to do that. So we're going to maybe consider some of that today. And most ironically with this ratchet effect, some CEOs are effectively rewarded for failure. If the company goes into a slump, the committees decide to pay them more to retain them because they don't want to lose them and they want to make sure that the skill is there. So now let's talk just briefly, very briefly, about different ideas that have been put forward about how to fix this. You'll be familiar with many of these. Ratios are one of the biggest ideas that's out there. On the surface, they seem pretty good, but there are loads of problems with measuring these ratios, and then following from that, how to enforce that these ratios are kept in a fair way. It's certainly understandable for some to argue for a return to ratios of the past. Say, things like 20 to 1 is a number that's floating around out there. But others argue, based upon research from places like MIT, that the increase in CEO pay since the 80s actually parallels quite neatly, you could say, the increase in the size of firms themselves, which are much, much larger today than they were back in the 80s. If ratios are too extreme, others advocate for pay transparency, which would require companies to publish their pay ratios. This is actually already in effect in the US, and it's supposed to take effect the beginning of next year here in the UK. There's ideas about a salary cap. I've been people on the other side point out that a company is a holistic unit, so it's not a zero-sum game. If the CEO helps grow the company, it should be lifting up the whole thing, so why would you want to cap the CEO's salary? Another idea, which I think has quite a bit of potential actually, is the idea of establishing multiple targets for the CEO, and they preferably somewhere like between 3 and 5, and they shouldn't be correlated, so that this makes it very difficult for the CEO to manipulate or game the targets, as they say. So examples could be that the CEO has to boost revenue growth, customer satisfaction, R&D investment, and maybe something like environmental sustainability. If he's working on all those things, and he has to do all of that in order to get his incentive or his boost, then research has shown it's just as likely as not likely that that's going to work out. Just two more. People talk about long-term incentives, which is good idea. Despite their name, they're normally only about 3 to 5 years right now, and that's problematic considering that the average CEO tenure tends to be less than 5 years. Okay. Again, the FRC has been recommending 3 to 5 years. I think the most recent governance code came out of July this year, and they've now said they recommend that these long-term incentives should be at least 5 years. So I think this is a good step forward, and this would probably include post-employment vesting is what it's called. So, and this is the case for CEOs like Paul Pullman, who's the CEO of Unilever. So he won't get all of his pay until actually after he leaves the company, and there are things set up for that. But of course, this is not legally binding. This is the corporate governance code, so it's advised, it's recommended. And then the last one is the idea of payouts at a constant rate, which is meant to kind of work against big bonuses for little changes. If any of you are familiar with Elon Musk, he recently proposed a really radical remuneration package. Something like if he grows Tesla to $2 billion, right? There's this mark, $2 billion. Then all of a sudden he gets a huge chunk. I forget how much it is, several billion. People point out that this is actually problematic because let's say Tesla is at 199 billion. He is disproportionately incentivized to boost it up to 2 billion and we can get a whole bunch of money. If we pay out at constant rates, then it wouldn't matter if he crosses that little bit, he would still get an incremental kind of reward. And then of course there's some people who say just get over it. Think about celebrities in our culture. Most of society generally doesn't complain too much about celebrities having a lot of money. We glamorize, we praise, we adore celebrities, so why should we care about CEOs? Now, taken on their own, a lot of these ideas have quite a bit of merit, but I think problems come in when they start to be different components are mixed together. So one example could be that share options seem like a really good way to compensate and align the interests of the CEO with the shareholders. However, if the CEO also has the power to issue big share buybacks for himself, then there's a problem. There's some ulterior motives perhaps at play. Additionally, pundits have pointed out the many unintended consequences of good or well-intentioned ideas, such as pay ratios, and there are many. This could involve, if there's a strict pay ratio required, companies might slash other benefits while boosting the basic salary or wage. They could use more automation in their company. They could employ more part-time workers. So this all leads me to think, and hopefully I can persuade you, we could argue that many of these ideas deal with symptoms, and we're hoping to get a bit deeper to some of the root causes. So that leads us to the next part of my talk. Based upon my reading of this ancient literature from various places, I've found what I think are three really big, main, and interconnected themes or ideas which emerge. And I think these are relevant for today and can offer some wisdom and insight. These themes are justice, dignity, and reward. Now, some of these terms are familiar, but I'm going to describe and kind of unpack how these are discussed in the ancient literature. Taken together, I think that these three themes constitute a cohesive, holistic vision of remuneration which focuses on the right amount of pay, okay, this is justice, for the right kind of work, this is dignity, which is executed with proficiency. Okay, that relates to the theme of reward. So let's begin with justice, the first theme. Justice in the literature is all about protecting people, with regard to remuneration, it's all about protecting people from destitution. Now, to be clear, humans do all kinds of work which does not seek compensation, things like domestic chores and voluntary work and caring for elderly and small children. But the concept of justice deals specifically with paying people the fair wage for satisfactory work that has been done in order to receive a wage, if that makes sense. Again, an important point to be made is that this is not charity. This is distinct from charity. A lot of the ancient texts are full of exhortations to care for people like the orphans and widows. But those people are not able to work, and other members of society are often not willing to work. So justice is about protecting the people who do, in fact, work. The fair wage is always connected with reasonable provision and security. It was not just enough to scrape by, okay? Jewish, Greek, Christian, Islamic thinkers have all generally accepted the market determining what a daily fair wage is, as long as it is mutually agreed upon between the employer and employee, and as long as that's done without coercion. Now we're going to come to that again in a little bit. Once again, although there are various moral warnings connected with excessive wealth in ancient literature, the texts tend to be much more concerned with supporting the bottom than they are with restricting the top. I'd like to offer a little illustration of why this might be, or to help us think about some of the kind of things connected with this. If we were to redistribute 4.5 million pounds, which is the average wage of a CEO in the FTSE 100 right now, if we were to redistribute that to 50,000 employees, which is kind of a rough average of a number of employees in the FTSE, which makes the maths easy, that would yield only 90 pounds per employee for the entire year. And that's taking the entire salary of the CEO, not just cutting it back, okay? This demonstrates, I hope, that the inadequacy of these kind of simplistic calls. We need to think a bit deeper about, I mean, this is very complex, but things like saying, hey, if we reduce the pay of the CEO, it's automatically going to boost everybody up on the bottom. It just doesn't work quite like that. Last, there are serious cultural factors to consider when it comes to justice, and as they deal with kind of perceptions of fairness and equality within a country or within a community. A pertinent example comes from Scandinavia, where CEOs are quite happy to take lower pay packages, and it seems various studies have shown that they actually perform equally well with their peers on the global market. Okay? Now we come to the next theme, dignity. This is all about affirming the worth of common work. Now, because much of the ancient literature comes from different cultural contexts, there are heavy implications relating to shame and honor, which we don't really have as much of a handle on today. If justice involves paying the fair amount for work done, and dignity involves paying the fair amount for the right kind of work, okay, shame involves paying the fair amount for the wrong kind of work, if that makes sense. Another way to put it is that an employer can pay someone fairly, but actually treat them quite poorly, okay? Crucially, this concept applies to both the top, the employers, and the employees. In ancient societies, if employers treated their workers poorly, they could lose a significant amount of status, respect, and honor in their communities. Wealthy people, such as landowners, often provided some of the only employment available, but they were still expected to act as patrons. Employees, if they worked in jobs that were deemed to be undignified, or if they were known to do poor quality work, they could suffer various forms and degrees of social isolation and exclusion. Fundamentally, dignity in work involved being satisfied with the fruits of one's labor, feeling proud of providing for one's family, and no, this was not the exclusive domain of men, and enjoying the social relationships afforded by respectable, honest occupation. Last, we have the theme of reward. And I'm conscious of time, I'm watching it. Reward is about leveraging exceptional behavior that is sustained and holistic. So I'm going to unpack those terms. Now, reward can be used to designate kind of just basically what one deserves. I'm using it here in a way that I think reflects more of the cultural understanding of that word, kind of a prize for special performance or achievements. Hopefully it doesn't surprise you that special rewards were distributed far less frequently in earlier times. With the exception of things like gift giving or bribery in the elite classes, rewards were reserved for the few people who demonstrated exceptional behavior over a long period. Crucially, the exceptional behavior of, let's say, a servant or a soldier was to be awarded if it benefited the whole group. This is really important. Thus, rewards involved increased responsibilities most of the time within an organization, with the recognition that exceptional leaders benefit everyone they lead. Another way to put it might be to emphasize kind of the idea of growing a person for the common good. The holistic growth that I mentioned is portrayed in the literature as the opposite of a type of narrow growth which results in either stagnation or fragmentation. Okay? There's some really interesting ideas about using wealth to separate oneself or distance oneself from other people. And today even, still, it doesn't really matter where in the world you are. You can find examples of a wealthy person who builds high walls or has a large gate with security or a long driveway or a big garden to kind of insulate themselves from other people. And the literature is very concerned about this separation and tries to encourage actually a growing of the whole organization or community together, a holistic growing. Finally, whereas we tend to couple the term reward with risks, the ancient literature contrasts reward with decisive penalties for failure. And this is especially due to the fact that leaders and patrons had so many people dependent upon them. All right? Now, last portion of my talk. Let's think about some implications of these somewhat ancient, maybe even distant themes. The first is justice. If any of you have studied management or economics, you may recognize a certain affinity with Hertzberg's hygiene factors. I think there is something to be said there. We can discuss that later if you'd like. One of the main obstacles to robust justice within companies today is the extreme distance between CEOs, up here at the top, employees, and shareholders. We need to think about ways to increase shareholder awareness about the real employee conditions. And it seems that suggestions about putting employees on boards should actually be endorsed. Seems like a pretty good idea. Regarding CEOs, we should assert that the market for determining their pay is not fair and challenge remuneration committees to build transparent packages from the ground up, rather than merely copying what other companies are doing. Most importantly, I think, we need to raise cultural awareness of and pressure for real living wages. It's one thing to check all of the legal boxes, but it's quite another to make sure everyone in your company is taken care of. There are multiple organizations that do calculations and run the numbers to try to figure out what it actually looks like, how much money you need to live decently in this country. The Living Wage organization is one of them, so they've said the real living wage, which is distinct from the national living wage, right, is $8.75 across the UK, $10.20 in London. The recent decision from Amazon actually provides a good example of the results from some popular pressure. They've just increased their wages to $10.50 in London and $9.50 outside of London now. This might be an example of some things that we're looking for. Secondly, what are some implications for this theme of dignity? And if you're tracking still, these would be Hertzberg's motivators, right? Generally, we should cultivate practices of bestowing and measuring worth in non-monetary ways and recover a cultural appreciation for good, honest, proficient work. Some of you may be aware of the thesis from Pickett and Wilkinson in their book, The Spirit Level, where they basically argue that extreme disparity in a society or group or community is worse than everybody being at a more modest, realistic level. Regarding the workers themselves, there are tremendous benefits to boosting employee satisfaction. Research shows that improving employee satisfaction increases stock price by 2 to 3% per year in the long term. Regarding CEOs, we should place much more value and emphasis on the non-monetary compensation that they could receive in their employment. Evidence from the Journal of Marketing Research in 2014 showed that CEOs were willing to take an average of a 12% reduction in pay in order to join a company with a strong and attractive brand or reputation. This was especially true for younger CEOs. There's this great quote that I want to include, which deals with, it comes from when Steve Jobs was trying to recruit John Sculley from PepsiCo to Apple to be the CEO. He said to John Sculley, "Do you want to sell sugar water for the rest of your life? Or do you want to come with me and change the world?" He did, in fact, go to Apple. That's another story. But we need to think about these types of motivations for CEOs and recognize that if we narrowly prioritize monetary compensation, we may attract CEOs who are primarily interested in narrow, perhaps even superficial monetary gains. The fact that certain wealthy people feel pressured to be philanthropic indicates, it seems, that they may desire respect or do some fascinating case studies of people like Bill Gates and Mark Zuckerberg, who have committed to giving away 99% of their wealth, and then other people like Jeff Bezos of Amazon, who is just starting to dip his toe in the world of philanthropy, okay? It may even be that our cultural vilification of wealthy CEOs has had the unintended consequence of boosting executive pay to fill some of these missing non-monetary compensation gaps. Finally, implications for the theme of reward. Generally, I think we need to foster healthier ideas about growth, which is emphatically not just winning in the economic lottery, and work against cultural forces which glamorize the dream of individuals becoming wealthy and kind of boosting themselves above all of their peers. Okay, this is not healthy, and it has the additional effect, of course, of minimizing the value of decent, common, proficient, good work. Next, the vast majority of workers should not be given individual monetary awards, but should be encouraged with fair pay for their proficient work. Now this is tricky. My own thinking, I don't think anybody can actually be static in competency. I think you're either drifting towards incompetency or stretching towards excellence. But that raises all sorts of questions about management we can discuss later if you want. Now regarding CEOs, there are several important implications. Rewards should not incentivize excessive risk-taking, which means no golden parachutes, as they're called. Rather, they should grow leaders who have demonstrated the consistent ability to take measured and realistic and wise risks. Following from that, CEOs should be clearly penalized for their failures. This is tricky, and long-term options could potentially, long-term share options could potentially work like this, but it certainly is not communicated in that manner to shareholders at present, right? Shareholders don't, in the report, read, oh, because EPS went down or the stocks went down, that effectively meant that the CEO was penalized or lost money. It's just not communicated in that manner. This suggests that clawback provisions are fundamentally inadequate because they effectively reclaim bonuses or prizes rather than actually penalizing. An ideal image of this, you may be familiar with, this type of penalization, is the unlimited liability, which used to characterize the Lloyd's underwriters who were personally and completely responsible for shortcomings. Finally, my last point about implications for reward. CEOs should only be rewarded with bonuses for undeniably exceeding expectations. Okay? Not just meeting what is reasonable or being competent in growing the company, which is what they're supposed to do anyway, right? Now, the best way to do this, it seems to me, is to gauge performance relative to competitors. Here's an example. Let's say a target is set at 3% revenue growth. 3%. A typical rigid incentive plan would reward a CEO who grew revenue by 4%, even if the overall sector grew by 8%. While simultaneously not rewarding a CEO who, let's say, grew revenue by only 2%, when the overall sector actually shrank by 2%. Do you see the difference? The first is not exceptional, but it meets the mark. The second is clearly exceptional, although it doesn't meet the mark. In conclusion, sometimes we here at the Jubilee Center talk about a kind of Copernican revolution when it comes to society. By this we mean, just as Copernicus argued that all the planets revolve around the sun, we argue that all facets of society revolve around personal relationships. Practically, for us here today in this room, this could mean that we heighten our concern of justice for the weakest members of our group, no matter where we fall in that group's hierarchy. It could mean that we acknowledge and encourage the dignity of every worker, no matter what kind of job we or they may have. And it could mean that we reward our truly exceptional leaders by respecting them, honoring them, and supporting them. Thank you very much.